change it.
I'll go and get.
Hi, everyone. Hello. Sorry, I think we're going to get started now. First of all, thank you all so much for coming and joining us today at the Wiener Holocaust Library. It's really great to have you here. And thank you as well to everyone on Zoom for joining us. We know we can't see you, but we're glad that you're here with us. Tonight's event, we're very pleased to welcome Maria Chamberlain to join us to speak about her book, Never Tell Anyone You're Jewish. Maria, as I'm sure most of you know, is an honorary fellow and honorary lecturer at the University of Edinburgh in the School of Biological Science. And we're delighted to have you here this evening to speak to us about and read from your book. But before I hand over, I'm just going to say a couple of very dull words of housekeeping. I do apologise. We're not expecting a fire alarm tonight, a fire test tonight. If the alarm goes off, please follow members of staff out the front of the building. The loos are downstairs. You access them via the lift. And in terms of the structure of this evening's event, Maria is going to speak, and then there will be a Q&A session at the end. If you're joining us on Zoom, please pop any questions you have in the chat, and we will do our best to get round to them. So yes, we are delighted to have you here. We're delighted to have you here as well, Maria. We tried this in summer, but we had to cancel because of COVID. So we're really pleased that we've been able to make this happen tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Maria, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Elise, for that fine introduction. And I want to thank the Wiener Library for inviting me to speak. It's a real honor. I've always loved libraries, and to secular me, libraries, and the Wiener in particular, has always seemed to be like a place of pilgrimage or worship, much more so than any church or shul. I shall tell you about some of the insights which I gained at this library in the course of my research. But I'll start with the cover photograph of my parents. This photograph is quite a haunting photograph. My parents on their wedding day in January 1946, and I was born actually about 9 months later. So it was quick work, but what is really surprising is that this photograph was taken just 8 months after liberation. So here they are, 2 survivors, 2 out of maybe 4,000 or so that returned to Kraków that summer of 1945, just after peace was declared. They were happy to find each other, yet what brought them together was not love, but the happenstance of their survival. I see a sadness in my mother's eyes, as if she's looking back at the traumas of the past and towards a rather uncertain future. And my father's hand is clenched, not caressing. You see, the term PTSD hadn't been invented yet.
What's that? His chat.
And they were offered no counseling. They didn't realize how scarred they were and how difficult each would be to live with. So they were married as Arthur and Jadwiga Bieberstein. But with a name like that, everyone would know they were Jewish. So they looked for a more Polish sounding alternative. They found Jurand, a noble character in a novel by Sienkiewicz, The Crusaders. Anyway, Jurand fought bravely against the Teutons, and then they thought, spot on. Let's have Jurand. So when I came to this country, of course, it was Durand, which wasn't so nice. They successfully made the change by deed poll just before I was born. So sadly, I never had the family name. They robbed me of my name, which was done to protect me. But I would have liked to be a Bieberstein, nevertheless. Despite my new name, our new name, Poles were always experts at detecting Jewishness. They knew fine who we were. Jew, Żyd, Żydówka must have been one of the very first words I ever learned. Well, everyone said we were Jewish, and Hitler must have thought so. So I knew it was kind of integral part of who I was. But we'd never set foot inside a synagogue. My mother, as far as I know, hadn't done so for the entirety of her life. Never in a synagogue. However, there were little relics of our Jewish past. At Pesach, at Passover, my father used to buy matzahs. I don't know where he got them, but he bought matzahs. And he brought them, hiding them under his gray coat. And I remember I loved them. So that was one. And then both my parents, me slightly less so, were very fond of gefilte fish. Gefilte fish made from carp that swam in our bath. After I saw it being massacred, I didn't really feel like the gefilte fish at all. But really, it wasn't these things that made me feel Jewish. It was the Holocaust. For my mother, particularly, and me, what defined our Jewishness was the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. It wasn't Judaism, about which I knew very little. Immigration to this country in 1958 at last gave my parents the chance of a new beginning. Never tell anyone you're Jewish, is what my mother said to me. She said it on the boat when we were coming over. Finally, we're free, she said. Free? So I kept stum. I was very isolated. My heritage, my family name denied. I really minded because I wanted to tell people my family history and the evil that had been perpetrated. Finally, in the last few years of her life, my mother relented, and she gave me permission to tell. She said she would have liked to write the memoir herself. She tried, but the experience proved too painful, so she never got through it. Hard. But her pen ran out at the very moment when her mother had died. So I've done it for her and for him, my father, and I hope they would have been pleased. by the result. Being Jewish but not religious made it difficult for me to find a sense of belonging. Most Jews that we came across in Edinburgh belonged to the Orthodox Hebrew congregation. "You're Jewish," they said, "but your family don't speak Yiddish. And Maria is not a Jewish name." "She was, you know," I would retort. I don't suppose they would have warmed to a Jew who eats ham and never stops talking about the Holocaust. That, by the way, is a line from Hadley Freeman's column. Hadley Freeman, whose column I miss so much in the Saturday Guardian. And I don't know if any of you have read or seen Tom Stoppart's play Leopoldstadt. Yes, you've seen it, yeah. Anyway, it's a semi-autobiographical novel because Stoppart himself was Jewish, although he only found out he was Jewish when he was 55. So his parents must have told each other themselves, "Never tell anyone you're Jewish," they must have said. So much so that they never even told their children. So Tom didn't know, nor his brother, that they were Jewish. And in Leopoldstadt, Stoppart confronts his Jewishness through a fictitious saga of a Viennese family. At the start, the cast is big. They're a vibrant family. They celebrate Pesach and bar mitzvahs, and they play games and they argue a lot. And as you can imagine, by the end of the play, there's not many of them left. But there is Aunt Rosa, there's 3 of them left. There's Aunt Rosa, who survived in New York. She emigrated before the war. Then there is his half-Jewish cousin, Nathan, who survived Auschwitz. And then there is the Tom Stoppart character, the 100% Jewish, Leonard Chamberlain. By chance, they called him that. And at the end of the play, in the last act, Nathan says to Leonard, "See me, I'm just half Jewish, but you, Leonard Chamberlain, are the full catastrophe." So here I am, Maria Chamberlain, the full catastrophe. The stories of my parents' lives, this is the site of the action, during the Second World War span occupied Europe. So that includes Kraków. At the bottom, I don't have a pointer. Yes, I suppose I do. Do I? No, anyway. It includes Kraków and Lvov, where my mother escaped to at the start of the war, and Warsaw, where my mother hid on false papers. And by September 1939, of course, Poland ceased to exist, divided along its rivers by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Later, in the summer of 1941, Hitler reneged on the pact. And this southwest area of Ukraine, named District Galicia, became absorbed into the general government. The first part of the book, my book, tells of my paternal family members, and here they are, my paternal family members. So that's another photograph to add to this wonderful exhibition, because that would have been taken about 1920s, 1922, 3, something like that. My father looks, there's my father, and he looks about 7. He was born in 1914, so that would have been about 1921. So the first part of the book tells the story of my father's family. And the second part of the book tells the story of my mother's family. Now, there's my grandfather, my mother's father, and my mother, aged about 14. And I have no pictures at all of my maternal grandmother, so I do not know what she looked like. But what I want to say is that my parents survived, and that's my parents probably at the start of the war. My parents survived in very different ways, and they confronted their traumas in very different ways. And that's largely what the book is about. My father, he was incredibly well disciplined, and as you can see, very clean shaven. So you can imagine how very upset he was when I brought home my husband with his long beard. And that was a very clearly stated dissatisfaction. My mother survived in a different way. My father survived by being hardworking and clean. My mother survived by guile and negotiation. My mother claimed that she knew a good person when she saw one. And indeed, several good people, Poles, Ukrainians, and Germans, are responsible for her survival. She was also the quarry of bad people, such as extortionists, prowling the streets, seeking out Jewish-looking faces, waiting for the moment to pounce. By the way, good and bad are how she and many other survivors tended to categorize people. I don't, but they did. The current Polish government outlaws allegations of Polish complicity, making it illegal for anyone, tour guide, journalist, or teacher, to bring to people's attention any individual acts of anti-Semitism or collaboration. The Poles are blameless, they say. They're all good. They're all good. Really? Is that realistic? When we know that in the dog-eat-dog culture that prevailed in those very hard times, each act of denunciation to the authorities brought with it a financial reward, which may just have saved your own family from starvation. Poles denounced Jews. Ukrainians denounced Jews. Even Jews denounced Jews. Surely history has taught us that you can't ascribe blame or blamelessness to an entire nation. Sanitizing Poland's involvement in Nazi crimes masks the fact that neighbors can turn on neighbors there and elsewhere, then and now. But back to this library and some light bulb moments which really lit up my researches. The first happened about 5 years ago when I was researching the subject of Amon Gert. Amon Gert, who had been the commandant of Płaszów camp, where my father was incarcerated for 2 years. My father had always said that he had testified at Amon Gert's trial in Kraków in September 1946, just 6 weeks before I was born. Well, I hit the Google button, as one would, keying in Amon Gert and Arthur Bieberstein, my father, and nothing came out, nothing. Thought, well, maybe he was wrong. He was dead by then, so I couldn't ask. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe he didn't testify. maybe it was just an oral kind of throwaway remark. But I thought, surely not. He wouldn't be wrong about that. So I looked around the internet for Holocaust historians who specialized in Nazi crimes, and I found Dan Stone of the Royal Holloway. And I wrote an email to him. Luckily, you know, academics have their emails exhibited on Google, so you can get them. Anyway, I wrote to Dan Stone. He replied immediately, and he said, yes, yes, yes. The entire transcript of the Goethe trial is in the Wiener Library. Wiener, I said, is that in Vienna? No, he said, it's in Russell Square. So I emailed the Wiener Library, and when I next came to visit my family in London, I said I would come. And so they knew I was coming, and they couldn't have been more helpful. They made me put on white gloves and, of course, a pencil, because you're not allowed to write with a pen, and put in front of me, in flimsy covers, the entire transcript of Amon Goeth's trial from 1946. And I sat there over 2 days, spellbound, looking for my father's name. And I finally found it on page 327, 6 pages of it. So I have translated it in full. It was in Polish. I translated it in full in the appendix, but I intend to read my summary of it from the text. And this is from my book. One day before 6 a.m., when the prisoners were gathering on the Appelplatz in their work squads before being marched off to their places of work, Goethe arrived to survey the columns. He was in a bad mood because some prisoners had escaped, and to vent his anger, he mercilessly beat and then shot one prisoner at random and then another. He then proceeded to slowly make his way down the column to where my father was standing in his row of 4, saying, if anyone doesn't like what he sees, maybe they should step forward. I'm a fair person. I can talk with him, please. Luckily, he, my father, and the man nearest to him avoided looking Goethe in the eye, and so the rest of them were spared that day. In his statement, my father wondered whether Goethe was inebriated at the time. This is interesting, as historians have often said that the perpetrators were fueled by alcohol. In January 1944, the camp changed status from a forced labor camp to a concentration camp. Contrary to what the words evoke, the change in status brought certain improvements for the inmates, as new orders from Berlin demanded that prisoners could no longer be shot without a hearing. It was this alleviation of Goethe's powers that saved my father's life in his second face-to-face encounter with the commandant. One day, in the early months of 1944, my father went to a tailor's shop, intending to hand in his jacket for mending. Suddenly, word passed around that Goethe was on his way, and panic was in the air. My father, who should not have been in the tailor's shop during work hours, was told to go. He was just leaving when Goethe appeared on his white horse, boots level with my father's eyes. "What are you doing here? Come closer," he yelled. He whipped him raw with his horsewhip, but because of the new regulations, he refrained from shooting him. My father said he must have been one of only a handful of prisoners who were beaten but not shot. Later, people said that Goethe blatantly disobeyed the Berlin rules, and the shootings continued. The wanton violence against himself and the others must have left a deep and indelible impact. The wheals from the beatings healed to become silvery scars that crisscrossed his back, but Gert on his white horse. That's Gert on his white horse, repeatedly terrorized his dreams. My father's testimony of Gert shooting prisoners at random helped to inform the portrayal of Gert in Spielberg's film, played by Ralph Fiennes. There's a famous scene, that's my mother. There's a, where is it? I must have missed it, sorry. There is a famous scene in the film where Gert is portrayed on the balcony shooting prisoners at random from his balcony of his house. But when my father went and my mother, I took my parents to see the film when it first came out. My father started to whisper loudly, to the consternation of those around him. They were all appalled because he was interrupting the film. And I said, shh, 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 shh. And then I turned around and I said, please excuse him, he was there. So Gert wasn't on the balcony shooting from there, but he did shoot prisoners at random. So while my father's survival tactic was to avoid meeting the perpetrator's eyes, my mother, by contrast, had a different strategy. Hers was to seek them out. And she had friends of all nationalities, specifically the German boss of the glass factory where she worked in Lvov. Before I read an extract from my book, which highlights this difference, I shall have to tell you a little bit of background to her story. My mother, at the beginning of the war in September 1939, along with many others, fled east to the perceived okay, I did have the photograph, sorry. That was the photograph of Gert on the balcony. So they were a bit misplaced. Anyway, here's a map. And this is the relative safe haven of Lvov that she fled to from Eastern, from Poland. So she fled eastwards, just like nowadays, people are fleeing from West Ukraine to the perceived self-haven of Lviv, to the west of them, except that this week, Lviv was bombed. Anyway, it's the same place. Lvov, Lviv, Lemberg, Leopolis, it's the same place. I've never been there, and now is not a good time to go. As you know, the Nazis' aim was to erase the Jews from the map of Europe, first with random shootings, and then more efficiently with mobile killing units, and finally by rounding them up and transporting them by cattle truck to extermination camps, where they were swiftly and economically gassed. Although the Nazis never told anyone where those resettlements were headed to, most people knew fine that the end was nigh. My mother had never heard of Belzec, but she knew that the transport was destined for extermination. So this is a reading from the chapter on my mother. My mother was rounded up on the first day of the action. The date, she told me, was 10th of August, 1942. Another witness described the scene. just as she had described it to me, again found probably in this library. Early in the morning, the guards blocked all the streets leading out of the Jewish district. Squads of 4 or 5 Gestapo, SS, and special paramilitary services spread out every couple of meters. Anyone putting up resistance got a bullet in the head. She was whipped and herded onto a lorry, but not before she had thrust a handwritten note along with some money into the hand of a passing Ukrainian boy. The note was for the attention of her German boss. The payment was for the messenger. The packed lorry was driven to the courtyard of a prison where SS men beat her and repeatedly kicked her in the stomach. From there, she was taken to Janowska camp. She tried to escape the electrified barbed wire fence, but was caught, beaten some more, this time with a board studded with nails until she bled. The whole purpose of the Janowska camp interlude was to assess her ability to work. But after all the beatings she had received, she probably didn't look her best. After roll call next day, she was selected for resettlement. But even then, she was not resigned to her fate. She thrust another note for the German director into the hand of a kindly-looking Ukrainian policeman. In the evening, along with all those who had failed the selection process, she was marched out in rows of 4 or 5 to the station where a cattle train, 50 wagons long, was waiting. Lining the sides of this trail of human misery was a cordon of Ukrainian guards, arms linked, forming a human chain. While she waited to be propelled onto the train, she did what she was always good at. She read the guards' faces. There were 2 of them, she thought, who looked more kindly than the others. She smiled at them, and she thought she detected a flicker of response. She was almost on the steps of the train when a cart full of skeleton-like prisoners drew up. As the guards started to load this human cargo onto the train, the attention of the Gestapo men was diverted. And in the commotion that followed, unintentionally or maybe intentionally, they let her slip through. Unnoticed, a Star of David, torn and discarded, she walked, feigning confidence, across the platform and slipped into the station cafeteria. This was not Costa Coffee. But she was not entirely unobserved, because standing at the door was an elderly waitress who said to her softly in Polish, "I know where you've come from." Discreetly, she led my mother into a dark corner of the cafe, placed a cup of coffee before her and a cigarette between her fingers. Then, lifting from her own neck a chain with a medallion of the Virgin Mary and the baby, she hung it on my mother's neck. "Hold on to her tight," she said. "She will save you." My mother's escape from that death train was one of the pivotal stories that I had grown up with. When I started to research the background and the historical context for this book, I actively sought out corroboration. And I found it in the second light bulb moment, which again took place in this library. Now, where is it? There. A Jewish Policeman in Lvov. This was a book I found on the library shelf by chance upstairs. It was a policeman called Belzec who was there on that station on that day at that time. Now, my mother described to me the view from that cafe. In the August heat, the victims were packed into cattle trucks, 100 people per wagon, each wagon intended for 6 cows. Their terrified faces at the grilled window cried out for water, water, water. It was a heat wave, you know. The Gestapo guards patrolling the platform jeered, "They'll be wanting toothpaste next." Now, Redner, in his book, witnessed another guard, and in his account, the jeering words were in the same tone, but slightly different. "What? You want water? Why not beer? Hello, bring some beer." Then he heard a shot and saw the limp body. He saw a girl break free and run from the thronging victims, their guards, and the train. Then he heard a shot and saw her limp body and smashed skull. So this alternative ending sent shivers down my back, and I was just so glad that my mother had never read those words. But it was really an uncanny moment in my research because it offered corroboration. So my mother escaped from that train, but when she returned to Lvov, she found out to her horror that her mother had been taken. So she, her mother, would probably have been on that very same train that she had escaped from. It was the beginning of survivor guilt that never left her. "Mamo, Mamo," she used to cry in countless nightmares. Belzec was the destination of that train. Through my research, I relived that one-way journey with the grandmother I had never met. She had with her a 4-year-old orphan boy, Romek. Both perished. Belzec, unlike most of the other camps, is rarely talked about. Yet, at least 500,000 people were processed in the 10 months of the camp's operation, and there were only 7 survivors. I also want to tell you something about my paternal grandfather, Marek, because Marek made it rather ingloriously into the history books of the Holocaust by becoming the first president of the Kraków Judenrat. That's the Jewish council. It became the Judenrat. There's quite a lot about him in published historical works, and it is with these that I started my research for this book. By the way, I started the research for this book soon after my son Martin, who is here, gave me for Christmas Philippe Sand's book, East-West Street. And in East-West Street, Philippe Sand starts with a chapter on his grandfather, Leon. And I thought, oh, that's a good idea. I will start with a chapter on my grandfather, Marek. And that's what I did. There's quite a lot about Marek in published historical works. I read them voraciously, and it allowed me to get to know him better. It also gave me a feeling of the time and a timeline into which to fit my parents' stories. Of course, to be the president of the Jewish community and later the Judenrat might in peaceful times have seemed like an honor, but Marek was forced to do it against his wishes. And I'll just read you a tiny bit on how they were treated at the Judenrat just soon after they were formed. Right, so Siebert, who was the Gestapo agent, instructed Bieberstein to present himself promptly to receive further written instruction concerning duties and competence, and just to show who was boss, and to make sure that the council, the Judenrat council, did not consider themselves above themselves. He bid them to perform humiliating gymnastic exercises. Rise, fall, rise, fall. Afterwards, the council members were made to stand with their hands raised and faces to the wall. So what you see is happening is it starts with discrimination, identification, and then humiliation, and then everything else follows. Anyway, Marek, like all the other Judenrat presidents in towns all over the general government, perished. He died in 1944. Of my 4 grandparents, only one survived. I think I've got a picture of him somewhere. That's Marek, by the way, that's Marek. And that's my surviving grandfather, who I absolutely adored. He was the only grandparent of my 4 who survived the war. And he was a very charismatic character who were good at clicking his heels and kissing a lady's hands. And he survived the second part of the war after his wife had been taken in plain sight, hiding in plain sight as a civil engineer in organization Todd, which was a quasi-Nazi organization. He made it. I don't think at any stage it bothered his conscience that it was a quasi-Nazi organization. He survived. So the third part of the book is more reflective. I analyze the mechanics of Nazi brutality and meditate on the nature of evil. The After the War chapter tells of my experiences of growing up in Stalinist Poland. I had such a happy childhood there. Such a happy childhood. And my school was amazing. And do you see my red kerchief? I was a real communist. I loved it. Swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. And here I am with the flowers. And that's my school. It was wonderful. My adjustment to life in exile in Edinburgh was in comparison a very difficult one. I was a latchkey child with 2 working parents, isolated and forbidden to play with the other children in our neighborhood. My parents suffered from nightmares and quarreled a lot. And I suppose I became impacted by their scars, both actual and psychological. After I left home, my parents decided to live apart, but they never divorced. They confronted their traumas in different ways, and I'm no social scientist and no expert in trauma studies. Their different reactions are interesting to compare. Both my parents went on to have, oh, well, here is Edinburgh. Here I am, a schoolgirl in Edinburgh. And here I am, a schoolgirl, standing by what is perceived to be the Scottish thistle, but let me tell you, it's, oh no, pardon, I'm a botanist and I know. And it's not Scottish, and it is a thistle, but it's not Scottish. It's just an incomer, just like me. And that's my father, just a few years before he died. Both my parents contributed to meaningful published advances in their scientific fields. My father became a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and a visiting professor in the US. My mother was a talented medical biochemist. They both lived into old age. And there is my mother with my eldest grandchild, Amy. And that's my mother just a few years before she died. Anyway, I owe my existence to my parents' resilience, nous, and courage. And I'm also grateful for their inspiration to follow an academic of research and teaching biology, which is a subject I love. Many of my friends, my students are now close friends, and some of them are on Zoom today. and they pop in to see me and they invite me to their celebrations. I'm also the proud parent of 2 sons and grandmother to 5 fantastic people. One of them is here today. My father never met his great-grandchildren, but the 3 older ones were the lights of my mother's life. Sadly, she didn't long enough to meet my son Tim's little ones in Edinburgh. Anyway, I hope that this book will allow them all to share my pride in our inheritance. But this book is not primarily for my family. At a recent book launch in Edinburgh, I was asked, who's this book for? Well, young people, I said, looking round the room, filled mostly, that was in Edinburgh, with my aging friends. But I say young people for a good reason. Mathematical studies have shown us that stories communicated to us by our grandparents protect the younger generations from committing or putting up with atrocities. Phases of mass destruction in human societies appear to occur in predictable cycles every 3 or 4 generations. In fact, the mathematical modeler who carried out his studies in 2016 presciently prophesied a period of unrest in the 2020s. And here we have it. I watch in disbelief. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It was very moving and really interesting. The readings from your book were wonderful as well. Just to say that we do have copies of the book on sale this evening, but I would now like to open the floor to questions, either through Zoom or in the room, but I'm going to take chair's privilege, if I may. I was so delighted to hear that the Wiener Holocaust Library's collections were so important in your research, but it strikes me that in researching your various family members, they had very different experiences and very different levels of representation in the archive. So it must have been a very different experience researching your mother versus your paternal grandfather, for example. So I was just wondering if you could reflect a bit on the differences in researching your relatives and whether ones were more satisfying or more difficult or more frustrating.
Well, the most frustrating thing for me was that I had very little information about some of my family members. As I said, I never even saw a picture, a photograph of my maternal grandmother. And I therefore spent time researching in her honor, really, the horrors of Belzec. I know very little about my Aunt Lula. My Aunt Lula, who was a baby in that photograph of the pre-war 1920s photograph. My Aunt Lula was 20 when the ghetto was being liquidated. And my Aunt Lula had fallen in love with a Catholic boy called Rishu. And with Rishu, she decided to defect to the Aryan side. So the 2 of them went off pretending, she pretended to be an Aryan. But, you know, times were hard and somebody denounced her, somebody betrayed her, and she was shot. So I know very little about her except what my father told me. But she was the baby of the family, and I think my father was a bit jealous of her, so he didn't tell me very much.
I do think, so the work that I do at the library is tracing individual victims of the Holocaust, usually for their relatives. And sometimes it's this very similar story. There's no trace of a person. But what we find is that there can be comfort found in the search, just in the efforts of trying to trace what has happened to a person. That becomes an act of commemoration in its own right, I think.
Well, like I said, when I was coming here, you know, approaching Russell Square, it felt like a pilgrimage. It was an act of commemoration. I felt very moved to be here. Yeah.
Honestly, it is wonderful to hear that the collection was used
Yeah.
in such an important and in such a successful way. I'm absolutely delighted to hear that was so important in your research. Are there any questions from the floor? Were you ever tempted to change your name back, by the way?
I wasn't, because I suppose by the time my parents died, I could have done it then, but it was too late because, you know, I had 2 Chamberlain children. I had 5 Chamberlain grandchildren. I wanted to belong to a family. Yeah.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Yes, I'll bring you the mic.
I was just wondering I don't know if you talk about this in the book, but that amazing story and also your early recollections of sort of buying into communist Poland and growing up in Edinburgh, what has that done to your Jewish identity and relationship with Judaism now and growing up with your family?
I have no relationship with Judaism apart from the fact that I now am a committee member of the Edinburgh Jewish Literary Society. I was in fact asked to be its chairman, but I said it wouldn't be appropriate because I know nothing about Judaism. I really know nothing about Judaism. I don't know about its high days and holidays. Nor did my mother. I mean, my mother actually, she did a terrible thing. She served ham to some Jewish friends who were absolutely horrified. Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions in the Zoom chat, unless there's anyone else on the floor who wants to ask something first. Yeah, okay.
You mentioned that your parents told you not to play with the other children in Edinburgh. Do you know what their motivation was for that?
They didn't want me to talk about our Jewish past. That was one reason. So I shouldn't blab, you know. We're free now. We don't want anybody to know. So that was one reason. I might not have been very discreet. I might have kind of slipped it out. And also my father, you know, like a lot of Jewish parents, it's achieve, achieve, achieve. That's what Jewish parents do to their children. I'm glad to say that my daughter-in-laws are not doing that to my grandchildren. And so my father wanted me to study instead of going out to play with the children.
I'm going, oh, yeah, oh, here.
Thank you very much. That was very moving and extremely interesting. I'm intrigued by the title of your book. Can you just tell us a little bit about what motivated you to choose that title? And is it a comment on what happened to your family, or is it somehow some kind of advice to Jews now, or
No.
a bit of no? Can you tell us then what it was?
It's not advice to Jews now. It was the advice that was given to me and which shaped my identity or lack of. You know, I wanted desperately to belong. I desperately wanted to belong. I tried out the Jewish community and they didn't want to know me. And I tried out the Polish community and they said anti-Semitic things, which put me off. And so never tell anyone Jewish is something that shaped who I became. That's why I chose it. It's certainly not advice to Jews now. And although I think it's a good title, the Jewish community, the frum Jewish community, don't think it's a good title.
we're tourists and we just happened to stumble across this event this evening. And I'd never heard of this until now. And I would just like to know how you're promoting your stories, other than through your book. How else are you getting the story out there?
Well, here I am doing a promotion. The trouble is that friends have read my book and friends of friends have read my book. But for it to get out there to people that I don't know, I need reviews. And it's very difficult to break through the cabals of reviewers. And so if anybody's got contacts, please let me know. Yes, if anybody would like to write a review on Amazon or I'm not sure about Waterstones at the moment, but anywhere else.
Goodreads is a good one.
Goodreads, yes, on Goodreads, yeah.
One more in the room.
Could I just ask you about the concept of forgiveness,
Yeah.
and whether forgiveness was something that you or your parents used as a mechanism for trying to come to terms with what happened to you and your family?
Well, it's a very interesting topic that really, you know, I've read so much about this and I find it fascinating. On the subject of forgiveness, the best book is The Sunflower by Wiesenthal. Have you read it? No. In the book, The Sunflower, which is about Ukraine, of course, you know, that's what they grow in Ukraine. That's why we've now got not very much sunflower oil. Anyway, Sunflower. It's a wonderful book. It's only about 60 pages long. But in the second half of the book, Wiesenthal interviews about 40 different people and gets their impression on what they make of the story. The story is about somebody who presumably is Wiesenthal, who lives in Lvov and is at the work camp in Janowska camp, where my mother was, briefly interned. And one day he is made to sit at the bedside of a German who wants to seek his forgiveness for all the terrible things he's done to Jews. As the token Jew, he has to offer forgiveness to all those who this German had caused to die. And it's very interesting because the Christian and Catholic point of view is that he should have offered forgiveness. And the Jewish point of view is you can't forgive in the name of people who aren't here to represent themselves. So it's a very interesting one on the subject of forgiveness. I can recommend that book. It's I kind of suggested it to both the reading groups I belong to. So, but my father, like the token Jew, would not offer forgiveness. My mother, would she have done? Maybe, because she might have responded to the Germans' humanity. I don't know. Do I offer forgiveness? I don't ascribe I don't think of groups of people, collective responsibility, bearing collective responsibility for what happens. People are people. You have good people. And sometimes you have good people who do bad things. And sometimes you have bad people who do good things. So I think everybody should have a conscience and battle with their own conscience about any evil acts that they perpetrate.
I think now we've got one more question in the chat that brings it back to the family side of things, which might be an appropriate way to wrap things up. So thank you in the Zoom chat for this. Melissa is asking, what do you think your parents might have thought about your book, and do you wish they could have read it?
That's a very good question. And Melissa, who is, I think, probably coming in from the US. Yeah, my father would have been wonderful. My father would have gone through the book word by word, and there would have been no typos at all. He would have said, this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong, but the result would have been much better. My mother, on the other hand, well, I don't think I would have wanted her to read it.
Fair enough. I think on that, I'd like to ask you all to join me again in thanking you very much for your book and for your time with us this evening. It's been really wonderful. Thank you very much.
For what reason?
And we do have copies on sale, and there is still drink at the back, so please do help yourself. Thank you all very much for coming. Welcome as well. Thank you for coming back. That's great.